Zoom has forced us to be on time.
Zoom
It used to be, you could 10 minutes late. But I think we
It's a
should.
rainy day in Nashville. Hi, everybody who's on Zoom. It's a rainy day in Nashville. We're letting people trickle into the room and we'll start in 5 minutes.
Yeah, right. And then it'll be 1 or 2 minutes after.
So I'm going to start you on 4.
You start me on 4.
She's the only one in. So she's the only one in currently. So that's why it's focused on her.
So is the webinar?
It is. We have started, recording has started.
35 years in the
Looks like 6 participants, attendees.
All right. So hi, everybody out there in Zoom land. Welcome to the Vanderbilt Preservation Summit. We are so happy to have you here. It is a rainy day here in Nashville. We're letting people trickle into the room. You can see the front tables of the room. There's a bunch more tables in the back, and we will be getting started in just about 5 to 6 minutes. So we're looking forward to hearing your questions during the Q&A. We're so happy that you're here, and we'll see you soon. Great. So we're unmuted. We have people arriving on Zoom. We have a few more people arriving in the room here at Vanderbilt to kick off this Cultural Heritage Digital Preservation Summit. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for the Zoom audience. Thank you to the person audience, and hopefully we'll actually be able to get talking to one another during the Q&A sessions. Bear with me, I'm going to make a few announcements. So first, I'm going to thank a bunch of people. I'm going to thank Tim Gollins and Cliff Anderson and Celia Walker for supporting this event. I'm going to thank the people who helped me put it together, which are Shora Griffin and Christina Bisbee, Teresa Benedetti. A huge thanks to Carla Beals for the website. Thanks to Julia and Eleanor for helping us moderate on Zoom. And thanks to folks who helped out with the outreach, which was Jody Gamble, who spread the word to the Tennessee Library Association, and to Angela Keene, who spread the word to the Nashville Area Libraries Association. Thanks to the tech support, which is Colin Nixon, who's helping with this session and this afternoon's session. And thanks to Roman Di Gaetano, who's going to help us with the workshop. I'm so happy to have that tech support. Thanks to Tristan Keene for making basically everything run, I think, around here. And thanks so much to Paul Conway, who he just has been amazing to work with, put a lot of work into making this whole event happen. I'm going to preview and remind you, please, to go to some of the other sessions. We have an open dialogue on digital preservation this afternoon at 4:30. That is going to be moderated by none other than John Shaw, the university librarian. And tomorrow morning, starting at 9, we have 5 presenters who are going to be presenting on topics related to digital preservation. And those, it's like a very intersectional kind of interdisciplinary workshop. We're looking at a lot of the issues that arise for librarians and archivists giving access and digitizing materials, including topics such as copyright, such as memory in local communities related to the Jefferson Street Sound Museum, IR, institutional repositories, and trust and verification, and technical things with open reel tape and handling and preserving open reel tape. We have a lot of the presenters here: Rogers Hall, Martin Fisher, Paul Conway, Jim Duran, and Rebecca Frank will be joining us tomorrow from an array of organizations within and without of Vanderbilt. That session was originally planned at 11:01, so just remember, you're going to come right here to the community room for that. We changed it. So for today's keynote, we are going to have a Q&A session afterwards for everybody who's on Zoom. When we have that Q&A, you can put your questions in the Q&A of the chat in Zoom, not the chat, the Q&A in Zoom. We can also unmute you and let you speak to the room in your own voice. So now let's get going. I'm going to introduce Paul Conway. Paul Conway is Associate Professor Emeritus of the University of Michigan School of Information. His research and teaching have focused on archival studies, ethics of new technologies, the digitization and preservation of cultural heritage resources, particularly audiovisual materials. Prior to joining the University of Michigan in 2006, he was an archivist at the National Archives and Records Administration, a program officer for the Society of American Archivists, and senior administrator for libraries at Yale University and Duke University. He holds a PhD from the University of Michigan and is a distinguished fellow of the Society of American Archivists. So welcome, Paul. Let's give him a hand. Thank you for being here. And I think that you're going to be able to kind of, yep, do the red. Thank you so much.
Okay, the first thing is that, right? And then oops, I wanted to go, I have to go to the start. There, now we go.
And then don't forget to share screen on Zoom.
Oh, I should have done that first. Here.
Yeah, I got you.
Mhm. Oh, there. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you.
Mhm.
What would we do without tech support? Thank you. Thank you. Welcome to the people in the room. Thank you for coming. Thank you for treating me like a rock star. It's wonderful. And thank you to the dozens and dozens of people on Zoom. We all complain about COVID, but for good reason. But the tech advances that have come with hybrid meetings is a definite plus. We couldn't have 100 people, 85 people traveling to Nashville, and they wouldn't fit in this room anyway. So it's wonderful to be able to reach out in this particular way. My presentation today it sort of takes the form of a scholarly presentation. There's a lot of information that I'm downloading in a sense. So I do suggest both here and on Zoom to take notes of questions. So you can put them in chat, but you might just, if something happens, because I can double back and explain something that I've moved through quickly. There's a bunch of audio clips embedded in this presentation. I'm going to play as many as time permits. I can see the clock, so we'll go from there. The presentation itself and supporting material and a long bibliography, some sound clips, and some images, I'm going to bundle up and put into a Google Drive and make it available to anybody that has registered for the conference or anybody that's here. And so then you should be able to go through the presentation again. And in that regard, I sort of struggled with the sound clips because of copyright issues. A lot of this material hasn't been formally cleared in the legal sense, but so I'm trying to keep as many of the clips to 90 seconds or so, even though there may be 4 or 5 or 6 minutes worth of okay, there we go. So we'll start. This is just to test the sound for everybody. And if you can't hear this in Zoom, then that you let us know. This is the intro to Music Time in Africa. That for 45 years, this was the intro.
It's Music Time in Africa. Hello, and a very good Sunday evening to you, friends. I'm Rita Rochelle in Washington, and it's my pleasure to serve as your hostess and music guide for our program of popular and authentic traditional African music.
What I'm going to do today in about 45 minutes is to characterize a fairly significant collection of audiovisual resources that are now housed at the University of Michigan Library, and tell you a little bit about the collection, and then present a case study of how that pieces of that collection might be used in scholarship to answer questions that go beyond the nature of the collection as a radio program. There's a lot of radio resources out there, and radio scholars tend to focus on radio as radio and the history of that program, et cetera. So what I'm trying to do with this case study is push the boundaries a little bit and thereby demonstrate both how one might work with a complex audiovisual resources, and then for librarians and archivists, the challenges it presents for assembling and making this kind of material available. And then to speculate about the implications for digital curation going forward. My case study is going to focus on the use of the Music Time in Africa programs related to Liberia, which is one of only a number of areas. I put this photo in multiple times because it's my favorite one I've found over the years. It clearly characterizes the power of shortwave or FM radio to everyone in that has the ability to have one in Africa. So the starting point is the program Music Time in Africa, which is the longest running English language broadcast to Africa from the United States. It also is the longest, I think it's the longest in the world. There were some pre-existing BBC programs that were advertised, but they're not still operating. The Music Time in Africa started broadcasting in 1966 from Monrovia, Liberia. And I've listed here the hosts that have been fortunate enough to be the sound of Music Time in Africa. I highlighted Rita Rochelle because her voice, you'll hear her voice multiple times. The current host, Heather Maxwell, has been the host since 2012, and I believe Heather is logged into Zoom. So hello, Heather. The Music Time in Africa was created by Leo Sarkisian, who was hired by Edward R. Murrow in 1961. Edward R. Murrow was at the time the new head of the USIS, which encompassed Voice of America, the U.S. Information Agency, newly spun off from the Department of State. President John F. Kennedy recruited Edward R. Murrow to create a public face for American broadcasting outside of the United States. So, and Music Time in Africa was broadcast every Sunday, 6:30 GMT, initially from Monrovia, Liberia, and then from Washington, D.C., where it is still broadcast today. The show has changed. It's an hour long instead of a half hour. It broadcasts at different times, but it's the same wonderful show it's always been. The Voice of America, the Music Time in Africa has and continues to have a vast listening base that has often formed itself into fan clubs and written letters, and now to Heather and others send email. Leo Sarkisian, featured in the bottom here with some of his correspondence, personally answered up to 500 letters per month. And being a good government bureaucrat, he counted and kept track of and made copies of. And because what's the job of a bureaucracy but to protect itself? And Leo was great at keeping Music Time in Africa going. If I had a little bit more time, I could circle back and read this letter, which doesn't show up it's heart-wrenching, and it's one of hundreds of letters like it. Behind the Music Time in Africa radio broadcast, which if you add it up from 1966 to the present is approximately 3,000 Sundays. 3,000 Sundays. Back behind Music Time in Africa are the field recordings that Leo made between 1953 and 1985. There's a few scatterings after 85, and there's a few scatterings before 1953, but this is the heart of it. He traveled with support initially from a private for-profit radio record producing company based in Hollywood, and then up until the 60s, and then the Voice of America hired him to continue recording and continuing to use this material. So he recorded in clubs, he recorded outside in the field, and he also trained radio engineers in Africa under the aegis of the State Department and USIA to start and do their own radio programs using local cultural heritage material, which they then recorded and sent to Leo, which he was able to use. So the underlying heart is 360 reel-to-reel magnetic tapes with 2,170 tracks, all digital at this point in time. Leo was a quarter-inch tape man. He did everything with tape. And he retired in 2012, approximately at the time that the Voice of America was shifting to all digital. And by 2015, Voice of America is a digital production and broadcasting operation, as with television and almost all radio stations everywhere else. The distribution of Leo's recordings, he made recordings in 34 African countries. This is color coded for the frequency. So Nigeria and Liberia that I'm pointing to here are the most frequent places that Leo made recordings. This is a hand-drawn map from Leo's scrapbooks, which we also have, that shows the trips that he made through Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. And I'm going to be focusing on the Liberia piece. All of this formed an organic working library to support a radio program. Organic working libraries exist in analog and digital forms in every radio station in the world. So this is about Music Time in Africa, but it's also about the kind of archive that gets created to support an active radio program. Whether it's saved or not, whether it moves into an archive or not is another matter, but it exists as an organic library. This is Leo and Mary Sarkisian around the time of their retirement. Lurking in the background is Kelly Askew, who's now the chair of the anthropology department at Michigan and my partner in crime on this project. Kelly's an expert on all things cultural heritage property in Africa. And my little corner of expertise has to do with making this stuff available. This is pictures of the library as it was being packed up. Leo retired in 2012. In 2012, they dedicated this room to him in perpetuity as the Leo and Mary Sarkisian Library. And then in 2014, Kelly got a call from Heather saying, well, they have to close the room down because they're all digital now and nobody wants this stuff. We need the room. So can you send some students to help us box this stuff up so we can send it to Iron Mountain underground storage outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is where the National Archives and agencies keep their unwanted, unloved material of all formats. And instead, Kelly and I worked with the University of Michigan to develop a gift agreement and a memo of understanding that transferred everything in that room unprocessed as is chaotically into to the University of Michigan. We received it in 2015 and have spent the last X number of years, 7 or 8 years, working with this material. So this is what it looked like when it was being boxed up. This intrepid woman in here was making these crazy Excel spreadsheets, which we had to use. It was boxed up into boxes randomly. This is typical, very typical. Put onto a box by truck, shipped to Ann Arbor, along with, importantly, 2 tape recorders that were used to make the show in the first place. And using students, this is one of my favorite pictures, my buddies, the students back in 15, 16, 17, and 18, organized and prepared it for processing. We wrote a grant to the National Endowment for the Humanities that allowed us to digitize 700 radio programs and scripts. I'll tell you about that in a minute. And then we continued to archivally process the collection. So it looks like this. Elizabeth will recognize this because Elizabeth Batuk did the processing as an intern and prepared the finding aid, which is listed at the bottom. It's a little bit of a work in progress for reasons that could come out in the Q&A. I want to be upbeat and positive instead of not about the finding aid, but about how difficult it is to get the last 10 feet in any kind of processing project. So it consists of 261 boxes, 6,600 plus analog audio media, 2,000 graphic and print items, and 12,000 plus electronic files. The challenge, the question for the next segment here is, what do you do with it? What can you do? And so I want to back this up with a little bit of scholarly literature about how people are thinking about using radio and cultural heritage materials, especially relating to Africa. So the first place is radio studies and sound studies, of which there's a growing and interesting body of scholars. There may be people at Vanderbilt that specialize in radio or sound studies. I have 2 quotes here. The poet, actor, and historian Sean Street, in his 2015 book, The Memory of Sound, Preserving the Sonic Past, notes that for several generations, radios have carried sound that transferred to memory while becoming a part of memory themselves, and in doing so have become absorbed into their own histories. So we can think of the radio broadcast not as an ephemeral one-time thing, but as a memory-building exercise for the people that heard it. Radio futurologist James Cridland speaks to the distinctiveness of radio broadcasting and the audience. I think there is a difference between radio and audio in terms of consumption here, he says. I sometimes say that the difference between them is one of liveness and connection. If you are listening to the live radio signal, there is a subconscious knowledge that you are listening along with other people, even if it's individual. As for the archival record of that memory, Street goes on, the ultimate trajectory of content in archives must be dissemination. Preserved sounds serve little purpose if they languish in academic institutions, regional or national repositories available for the use of a limited few. Now, any of you who have worked with audio and visual collections know how complex they are, not only to process, but also to use. So this is an aspirational statement. Fortunately, the Library of Congress has stepped up to support radio preservation. There was a wonderful conference, I've lost track of time, it would have been May, at the Library of Congress. 350 people showed up in person to give lightning talks about the use of radio, sponsored by the Library of Congress. That link is in my bibliography. The link to all the sessions is there. There's also, with the support of the Library of Congress, there's a new sound collections database built to help assemble information on processed and unprocessed radio and sound collections. If you have this kind of material at Vanderbilt, you can log in, create a record, it gets vetted and then approved and posted. Okay, so this is my last sort of pointy-headed academic exercise here. What I'm trying to make beyond radio, I'm also looking at the relationship of these collections to the people that are the subject matter of the sound recordings in the first place. And again, this is not unique either to audio video or to archives in general, but the focus of this research and my pitch for archivists to get more engaged with the user, not the users of the archive today, but the people who are involved with the generation of that archive in the first place. And this is what people are calling proactive archiving. It's coming out of the scholarly community. This Music Time in Africa project is a scholar-led project in which, as a slight aside, it makes for complications with the relationship to the library and archive, because the demand for acquiring, processing, and making available this material is coming from the scholars, most of whom are based at the University of Michigan. And if you work in archives and libraries, that sometimes tension between who's in charge of the ship raises its head in this project in a big way. But proactive archiving is arguing for scholars to sort of drive the ship here by specifying what gets collected, what gets processed, and what gets made available in various ways, to whom, under what circumstances. And tied to that is this notion of decolonizing the archive and ethnomusicology just in general, that are trying to understand what the nature of the base material is and its relationship to the peoples who generated that content in the first place, and possibly give it back. There's a lot of work in that. The soundbite for our project is repatriation through rebroadcast. There's a whole nother, in the Q&A, we can talk about repatriation a bit. In some archives, people are putting this material on thumb drives and getting on a plane to Haiti or to South Africa and handing the thumb drives back to the people who then have to do something with them. CDs. Sometimes people are bringing entire computer systems to villages. So you hear, take your stuff back. We believe that this was a radio program that was initially lodged in memory, and we want to rememorialize this material by rebroadcasting it. Okay, so that's sort of the heavy piece of it. So behind this project is an archival processing project, but it's also positioning this material to be used in innovative and new ways. So the focus is on the audience. In Liberia, where I'm headed, even today, with decades worth of work, the literacy rate is under 10%. There's been progress made. That doesn't mean that people are stupid or they're not plugged in or they don't care or they don't have ideas. It's just that they communicate orally and make their feelings known by standing in the street and telling people what they want. Radio listening is ubiquitous, and it has been since the mid-1960s with the advent of the transistor radio. Voice of America was not unaware of that in launching programs that were initially on shortwave and then in FM radio stations. And Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook has launched geosynchronous satellites over over the African continent to make sure that people can get Facebook now. So the notion of remote access to information beamed into your ear has been in place since the 1960s. I have more to say about Liberia in a minute. So Voice of America, to sum up this point, and then I'll move on to show you a bit more about how you might think about the materials in this context of repatriation, the subtext of their creation in the first place. The Voice of America broadcasts music time in Africa to the African continent every single Sunday evening since May 1966, through transformative and often violent change in West Africa, especially during the time that I'm focusing on, through the peak of the Cold War and beyond. I could have put Cold War in quotes because we still have lots of issues there, through 12 US presidential administrations, 22 VOA directors, and at least 3 major agency restructuring. That in itself is a miracle. If you've gotten anywhere near a state, local, or federal government agency, the fact that this program is every single Sunday for 3,000 broadcasts, why? How did they pull that off? And it's always scheduled just prior to the news program. So is the jazz. The Conover's jazz program in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was broadcast. People loved American jazz, and so they did an hour-long jazz program and then hit you with 90 minutes of news. So maybe that's part of it. So let's see what I've got here.
Leo, those are fantastic rhythms. I like the way you demonstrated the drums and the rhythms, Mr. Music Man. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I know that the 3 cone-shaped drums were made with the ears of elephants, and the slit drums were made from half sections of trees and standing on 4 legs. And about the dancers and the dance, the most attractive feature in the old days was the bright scarlet headdress of the dancers, made from the tail feathers of the Congolese great parrot. Actually, the feathers were a great treasure, representing a sign of wealth or social position in the tribe. And Rita, traditionally, the feathers also represented part of the token payment of a bride's lobolo, or dowry.
That's very interesting, Leo. Thank you. Now we can imagine and focus in our minds what the Ebi dance may have looked like, and that helps us to feel the excitement of the music as we listen to this recording.
So the question that rises for purposes of the next 15 or 20 minutes of demonstration is, in what ways has this 3,000 continuous program, this programming every Sunday evening, been intentional as opposed to eclectic? Leo loved the people and loved the music and loved doing the show. And just like a DJ that gets to broadcast from 10 p.m. to midnight or midnight to 2 p.m. and you can do anything you want, the same question arises. Is there an intentionality behind kind of DJing or not? Why? And so I want to add, that's the question, is in the context of Liberia between 1963 and 1990. So why focus on intentional? One is that the VOA charter prohibits overt influencing of local affairs. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't be subtle by the way the tone of voice or the choice of what news is going to be broadcast or what music is going to be broadcast. But the VOA charter is explicit about not being the mission. The long-range interests of the United States are served by communicating directly with the peoples of the world by radio. To be effective, the Voice of America must win the attention and the respect of listeners, the so-called hearts and minds. There are also explicit guidelines for programming both entertainment programs and news in terms of what can and cannot be said, in what order, and it's excruciatingly detailed. Those guidelines are fully available on the web. Why Liberia? Liberia is one of 53 countries in the African continent, and it's one of 34 that Leo made recordings in. But Liberia has a special relationship with the United States. It was founded in 1822 by freed enslaved people from the United States who got on boats and with money from a private corporation to buy land. They bought land at gunpoint, formed their own colony, which for at least 20 years was a colony of the United States of America, the only colony that America actually formed. We had our colonial world, but Liberia was there's a very strong U.S. presence. Up until the Civil War, I'm going to get to that in a minute, and that started in earnest in 1990, but was actually looming in the period that we're going to be talking about here. Liberia was a form of apartheid state in which the Americo-Liberians, descended from freed slaves, were the 10% of the population in charge of everything, and the 90% of indigenous cultures, 27 languages, 16 tribal groups were in the hinterlands, and they use that term, hinterlands. The reason that the Liberians thought it was not a apartheid state was because they had cast a path to becoming fully fledged Liberian, and that was through learning to speak English, getting yourself educated a bit, participating in the trade from the north to the south, and most importantly, converting to Christianity. And there's no wonder there was a 20-year civil war, with that being the criteria for becoming a full-fledged Liberian. The U.S. presence from the 50s, 60s, and World War II, they built a base there. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were fully 10% of Monrovia's population was U.S. government employees or their dependents, huge presence there. And also it's where Music Time in Africa started, in forming in 1963 and broadcasting in 1966. Music Time in Africa was broadcast from Monrovia until 1968. Then they picked up the whole operation, moved it to Washington, D.C., where it has been playing out since then. If you're interested in understanding an accessible memoir and biography, this Helene Cooper's Madam President is the story of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was the first female elected president of any African country, elected twice. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011 for her work with democracy and peace. To write this book, Helene Cooper went all the way back and gives you the whole story going forward. So why the time frame? The Voice of America relay station, which I'm going to end this little segment with a discussion of the relay station, was built and came online. The shortwave relay station was built in 1963 and was destroyed by rebel warfare in 1990. And in between, it was the second most powerful shortwave broadcasting relay station in the world. It was capable of receiving a signal from Greenville, North Carolina, broadcast from Washington, D.C. to Greenville, amplified, sent to Monrovia, in which it was amplified again, and the signal covered the entire African continent. The entire African continent. So all those shortwave radios were coming from Monrovia until 1990. So it makes sense to focus a little bit on Monrovia. So what I've done is a very close reading of audiovisual and textual evidence from Liberia recordings made by Leo in 1965. I've got a slide coming up about that. And then close reading and listening of 75 radio shows that have extant ones that have Liberian musical content that survive in some form in the archives, and then contextualizing all of this in terms of Liberian history and culture, major events, BOA presence, et cetera. Okay, so the evidence itself for Liberia alone is 86 quarter-inch magnetic tapes, original tapes, made in the field by Leo with his recording equipment, dragged all over the country of Liberia. It adds up to 479 individual songs, tracks, etc. Approximately 6 hours in Lofa County alone. It's many more for the country of Liberia. They tend to be 7-inch, quarter-inch magnetic tapes, fresh tape hauled into the bush to be able to do this work. In many cases, we've found evidence of permissions asked by those who were capable of signing their name to a document. Sometimes money changed hands to make the recordings. In many cases, Leo took copious notes during or immediately following the recordings, which he typed up. The beauty of these notes, they're difficult to read here, but some of them are, I'll put examples on the Google Drive, is that he named the names. That he showed respect for the people he was recording by naming them. And also giving a little bit of background. Curiously, though, one of the themes that runs through these notes is whether the people that are being recorded have ever been away from the little town that they were in, thinking that, oh, everybody's isolated up there in the hinterlands and Monrovia's down here running the show, and it turns out a lot of people had traveled all over the place doing their performances, and Leo made sure that if people had traveled, that he made note of that. And then where appropriate, he transcribed from a native language through Liberian English and into plain English the kind of parables that that form the vocal tracks, and those are all listed as well. So this is a tremendous amount of raw material there. There's also scripts. Approximately half of the radio programs have the full radio program with the announcer's voice, all the musical cuts, plus a script. The scripts, I'm sorry, we digitized them and they look better on the screen than they do on this projector. The evidence for the radio program itself is a typical, if we had everything, if Leo Sarkisian and the Voice of America were in the business of creating an archive, a record of their programs, that right here, the bar that says 50, it would be flat because every program would be recorded all the time and archived. The VOA doesn't do that. None of their programs are recorded for posterity routinely. The jazz program is the most commonly recorded, and those are deposited in the National Archives, largely because it's US content, my thinking, as opposed to content from African countries. So what we have here is a typical, I'll call it a fly-by-night radio program, where you cannibalize the older material for rebroadcast, and after a while, you've got plenty of material to play with, so you just start rebroadcasting, tweaking the scripts, but using the same music over and over and over again. So we have this drop off from Rita Rochelle, where everything was recorded for this period, and it drops off to nearly nothing. And this is the point at which it shifts to digital. So by the time we get to Heather Maxwell's programs in 2012, Heather kept everything. Thank you, Heather. All the scripts and all the programs are kept because Heather wants to keep them, not because there's somebody from the Voice of America saying, thou shalt archive the program. She might correct me if that's. So what we've done with the Music Time in Africa is a custom built delivery system that is available. I can show this in the Q&A, so I'm going to go through it fast, but it's either tiles or lists. It's faceted browsing on the left side, which means the metadata there allows you to click through and find other things with similar content. On this one, I searched for Liberia. I clicked on the country code and I came up with 75 programs. I click on an individual program and you get the script juxtaposed with the metadata that's associated with that script. Each script has been subject to optical character recognition and selective cleanup. There's a whole nother story there. So you can search in the search box for the words in the script, or you can click on the one of the metadata tags on the side and get similar items. Sometimes things are unique. Sometimes you'll get 80 hits. This is what happens when you search for elephant. You get 27 results from some combination of the script and the metadata tags. So let's plunge in. I've got 15 minutes here to show you some more stuff. Okay, so this is a 1965 map that shows the non-existence of roads. The red circle shows where Leo and his team made recordings. There was a road, but where they were recording is inside the red circle here. About a week and a half worth of recordings, 7 different locations, multiple, all the notes, etc. No roads in 1965. This was part of the development process that was going on. So you wonder, Leo had to cross rivers with his equipment in dugout canoes. The hammock carriers, you might have heard that term. This is a hammock carrier. These are people carrying people and equipment in hammocks with a sun screen over the top, fording rivers, etc. This is the vine, so-called monkey bridges that cross the rivers. Okay, tape recorders, boxes of tape, etc. This is a more from 1965, a little wooden bridge. This is how you got to Mambo and Gonuelo. And so at one point, Leo felt expansive, and he said, Rita asked him on the program, well, what was your recording experience? And he says, when I joined the Voice of America, I was based in Monrovia. And again, I was lucky to find a working partner who was also an expert in folklore and music traditions in his country, Bai Timur, who was also a famous writer and a poet. Well, we traveled all over the country from region to region, walking for miles through forests and deep jungle, making hundreds of recordings in small remote villages. Several times we even traveled in small canoes up rivers and creeks that were full of crocodiles. So let's hear something. This is a recording of Bese Kobo and his drum set. Bessie's named. If I were to be able to follow these notes down, the individual transcriptions of the musical recordings that he did is also in the notes. This is the script that goes with what I'm about to play for a minute. This is a very cool recording.
Go ahead. Gonello, reel 1, track 2. Yo ambazule no mele mama no bueno abe ba yo ambazule yeah no mele mama no bueno abe ba yo ambazule ya we me anu ye we bona ma bona ya le da o ma zara bonya lo ma zara bola ma ya mo la ma amale bale bale ya le we o ma me le we ay ko bonya le we.
Musicians are working really hard right now to find beats like that to use in contemporary music. So this particular recording was used over and over and over again in different contexts, sometimes with a show that was all about Liberia. Sometimes it was to portray the kind of instruments that were used in the song, sometimes the language structure. So the same clip could appear in different shows depending on what was going on. The point of this, when you look at the notes from Mambo and Gonuelo, though, is how many musicians were ready to step forward to make their recordings. And Bai Timur, who was at the time the Minister for Information and Culture, which is sort of like, we don't have people like, we don't have ministers of information and culture in the United States, but it was a very powerful organization for the president of Liberia to establish the connections between native populations and the government, which was trying to bring unity through education, language, and Christianity. So they were not out there out of curiosity. They were out there to find out who was who and where they lived and et cetera. Okay, so Zorzor, this circle up in the corner, the road was pretty good. You'll see in a second, so they could drive their cars. Zorzor and in Lofa County. This one is a recording of elephant tusks. I'm going to play it and then explain why it's important. There's 3 sound recordings at the bottom. I'll give you the first one is Rita introducing Leo. So Leo gets to explain for himself. The second one is an older use with an earlier broadcaster. And the third is Rita Rochelle saying Leo's words. And the point of this, of having 3 is how absolutely scripted the program was. Every single word that came out of the announcer's voice was written by Leo Sarkisian, no matter who was the person that gave it. But Rita was so good and that you'd never know that she was reading from a script. So I'll just give you a couple of quick pieces of this.
This next recording is music of Liberia. Leo recorded this in the small town of Zorzor. So I'll have Leo tell us about the music.
This recording features an orchestra of horns made from elephant tusks. The orchestra is actually similar to the type of music groups that were performing during the time of the great Mali Empire in the 14th century. We know this by the careful descriptions in the writings of Ibn Battuta, the Arab traveler and geographer who visited the Mali Empire during the 1300s. He described the ivory-tusked horns in detail about the drums he saw and what the music sounded like. Well, I recorded similar groups in Guinea as well as in Liberia. In this recording by Pele musicians of Zorzor in Liberia, there are 6 horns accompanied by 2 drums. The music and song are for a warrior's victory song.
Still popular in the interior of Liberia are the old traditional elephant tusk horn orchestras, unchanged through the centuries. Even in the historical records of the ancient empire of Mali, and in the writings of travelers to ancient kingdoms of the past in West Africa, one can find detailed description of large ivory tusk horn orchestras playing for kings and warrior chiefs. This excellent recording was made in the town of Zorzor, and it features a group of Pele folk musicians consisting of 6 large horns, each different in size and pitch and accompanied by 2 sets of drums. One set has 2 drums and the other 3 drums tied together. Each drum is also different in size and tone. The chief singer is also the leader of the group.
So the point may be obvious. What boundaries? What tribes competing with each other? Your history? In 2 minutes worth of voiceover with instruments that no one has seen and can't be seen, you get a nutshell message about the depth of the historical culture in an area that was about to blow up because with the tribes competing with each other. The other piece of this is though that recording of the elephant tusks, to the best of our knowledge, is the only thing of its kind. Many museums of African heritage have the elephant tusks, but people don't know how to play them. That knowledge is gone, and if you can even touch them and put them to your mouth, might be able to figure out how to play it. But to the best of our knowledge, this recording that Leo made in 1965 is the only recording of elephant tusk performers that we've been able to find. So the uniqueness of just the music itself, and then how it was used multiple times over the looming Civil War to send the message that we're all we have a deep history here, and you should appreciate that, is what's sort of important. Finally, up in before I move to the Civil War itself, the third circle is up in Voinjama and Kolahun, which in Voinjama, the thing to know about Liberia in Leo's recordings were not the slightest bit accidental. The president at the time, part of the unity process was to create an administrative state. And in 1965, late 64, 2 months before Leo and Bai Timur launched through the hinterlands of Liberia, the president of Liberia declared 4 new states, and with administrative capitals, one of which was Voinjama. And in fact, by the time Leo and Bai Timur got to Voinjama, it was so new, they didn't have the administrative building. So they had to go to an army headquarters in Kolahun by boat to get to the administrative head of this new state. Liberia is a state the size of Tennessee, and it is about the population of Tennessee. So you can imagine that the president of the United States decided that everything east of Nashville was going to be a new state, and everything west of Knoxville was a new state. And by the way, there's only I-40. That's it. What do you do? And so this jarring, so they show up with their recording equipment and the Minister of Information and Culture, and they spend weeks listening, learning, talking. The road was halfway decent until you got to Voinjama, then you couldn't get any further. This is a quick recording of a belly harpist. You can see in the background this was recorded in Voinjama, the brand new. This is the administrative center that was under construction at the time the recordings were made. So they noted that this gentleman was 25 years old and that he hasn't really traveled much. So this is unusual. This is the song itself. It's another good one.
Uyamaye uyama kwandundungu wake wilo no klango uyamaye uyamaye uyama naga polo je wilo no klango uyamaye.
This goes on for about 6 minutes. Very, very well done in terms of a recording. This is the script, one of the scripts that goes with explaining what was going on here. Sometimes the scripts are longer and sometimes they're shorter. Okay, 2 more examples. Borkazar, which is on the road between Zorzor and Voinjama. This is a Google Maps picture of what it looks like today. Not a whole lot of difference from what it looked like in 1965. It's an intersection near the border with Guinea. All of these recordings, coincidentally or not, were made near borders. They didn't do recordings in the middle of the country. They went around the borders. I wonder why. Leo, the reason I'm featuring this one, my point here is about in the 60s with the opening up of this country and the determination to kind of modernize the hinterlands. It also, this area came to the attention of anthropologists, ethnomusicologists, journalists, and others. And there was one moment which happened to have been photographed where Leo was in Borkazar at the same time that an anthropologist from Harvard, a journalist from the UK, and a PhD student in educational development all happened to land in this town on the same day. And Willie Witten, the educational PhD student, took 25 or 30 pictures in Borkazar, which happened to capture Leo making his recordings. So here you get the confluence of kind of the external academic investigators, which then have charted their own story. They all wrote dissertations, they all wrote articles, they all wrote books about what's going on in Zorzor and Borkazar, and whether or not that was the story that the local individuals would have liked told or not is another matter. This is Mary Sarkisian down here, getting ready to go into the vehicle that they carted around all their materials in. So these are some of Willie Witten's slides. Leo and Bai Timur with their recording equipment, they made 3 recordings. Iron players, 6 men named, a Sasa players with Sande, the Secret Society of Women, came from out of their space and sang for Leo, and this is the setup here. He never used this in any of the music time in Africa, but the Sande singers, the female Sasa players, is so rare and so unusual that I thought I would at least give you a minute of that. And then a lot of this music is unique in its own regard. You should get a sense from a little bit from these slides, the fairly elaborate setup of microphones and the mixing board. He had as many as 8 to 10 microphones all going into a mixing board. And I wondered for a while, why did they only get 400 tracks out of Lofa? But it might take 2 hours to do a setup and a test. And then there was take 1 and take 2, and that was all they could do. And then they had to move on to something else. Okay, so I should have played it when these are the notes about the women, the female Sandy singers. Sandy, very unusual to have them agree to make a recording. Two more quick things, and then I'll speculate a little bit about what I think it means, and then stop for questions because I really want to know what you think this all means rather than me. So this is outside the time period I said, well, getting up to 1990, but starting with in 1980, the president of many presidents met untimely ends through mean and nasty ways. So the president of Liberia in 1980 was killed by so Tolbert was murdered by Samuel Doe, who was then took over, declared himself a general. And in June 24th, 1984 was right in the middle as he was transitioning to free elections. And the elections hadn't happened yet. But meanwhile, Liberia sponsored a booth at the New Orleans World's Fair, which was celebrating the 100th anniversary of the first New Orleans World's Fair. The Liberia booth was late because there was no money to build it. It was late in coming. It just opened in June, and then the Liberian government stopped paying the subsidy to the New Orleans Fair, and so the whole fair went bankrupt, and all of the people the Liberian citizens that worked in the booth asked for asylum because they couldn't come back they were from the wrong. Because the booth was focusing on tribal relations that were not in favor of the president of Liberia. You wouldn't know any of this unless you read a little bit of the history. So you've got this distinctive program here in which Leo and Rita are talking about how wonderful the native music is at the Liberian World Pavilion at the World's Fair. And at one point they say, I'll read it and then I'll give you the clip because it's like it's an out-of-body experience. Our final selection in tribute to Liberia at the New Orleans World's Fair is by the group called Ngoma Sasa with Maisha Al-Shabu, the talented musician, singer, and composer who, with her musical family, has made Liberia her home. I'll play this and then tell you why this is mind-boggling.
Selection in tribute to Liberia at the New Orleans World Fair is by the group called Ngoma Sasa with Maisha El Shabu, the talented musician, singer, and composer who, with her musical family, has made Liberia her home.
So that it's a great cut, but shortly after this was broadcast, she and her whole family who made Liberia her home fled Liberia and are living their descendants are living in Raleigh, North Carolina. And she went on to make some other really wonderful recordings, and she's a great person. But the messaging was, can't we still let people make Liberia our home, and can't we celebrate through a World's Fair how wonderful Liberian music was? But meanwhile, things were really looming. So December 8th, similar kind of thing. I'm not gonna I'm only going to play one more thing. In December 8th of 1985, Rita and Leo did a whole feature on the emergent Liberian recording industry by focusing on Studio 99 with Fatu Gafor and a number of the music makers and a bunch of other things. They interviewed Fatu Gafor and used her interview on the radio program, etc. Well, at the end, 2 weeks later, after this was broadcast, Fatu Gafor and her whole family fled Liberia. The National Cultural Center that she was head of was destroyed and broke down. And it's now I think it's not a Marriott resort, but it's the property has been reworked into a all-inclusive resort by a U.S. billionaire that owns the property. So the timing of this, in my opinion, can't be accidental. This threat to Liberian culture was essentially made public if you knew what to listen for. If you don't know what you're listening to, it's a fun, interesting program of Studio 99 cuts. If you are the audience, however, what you're hearing is that this is about to go down the tubes for us. And finally, the chaos of okay, I'm going to end with one little clip. This one is also stunning. And then I'll just have a few little slides on what I think it means, and then we want to talk. This is a contemporary 1963 view of the relay station outside of Monrovia, the most powerful relay station after the one in North Carolina. It was staffed by 90 people who lived in the area. And Leo, at least in 1966 and 67 and 68, was broadcasting out of this space, making his programs, et cetera. This is the view of the same property in 1990 after rebels from warring camps came in and completely looted and destroyed the entire operation. And it's for about a decade, there were 15 to 20,000 Sierra Leone refugees lived in these huts on the very same property where the relay station was. The U.S. saw it coming and did a couple of other, went to Plan B, Botswana. They bolstered the Botswana so they could broadcast up, and they built a station in Sao Tome and Principe, the island off the coast of Africa, and built a whole nother one, which is still operational today. You can see it when you go to Google Maps. If you know what you're looking for, you can see something that looks a lot like this. Okay, so this is a clip. I sort of gave it away. I didn't mean to by clicking forward. In which Leo and Rita are appealing to these musicians who have disappeared. Oops.
Music. Here's a dance band we introduced some years ago, and I guess we're lucky to have this album of their music in our collection. The band was called AFL, and they were a group of talented young men in Monrovia, Liberia. We don't know what happened to the group or where the musicians are today. If you do, please let us know. But right now, here they are with one of their usual upbeat tempo numbers from the album Money Man.
I clipped it. I'm compressing it so you can hear the end.
Amenme Shakara Shakare from the album Money Man by the AFL Band that was active making music in the early 80s in Monrovia, Liberia. As I mentioned before, we don't know what happened to the group or where the musicians are. It was a good band, and that's why I said we're lucky that our music man has this album in his own personal collection. Well, Leo will have more music for us in just a moment, so please stay with us.
This is the AFL Band. Armed Forces Liberia. There is no Money Man album. There's nothing. It's an appeal to these boys to be good boys. You're good boys. You're not murderers. You're not rapists. You're good boys. And it's so unusual for they broke the rule with that clip. Leo and Mary and Rita broke the rule about direct intervention through their voices. It also turns out that in 1985, they made a trip in the middle of all this chaos. Leo and Rita made a trip to Monrovia, put on a show so that they could take a closer look at what was going on. So the limitations of this is just a taste. There's a lot more that can be done depending on how you want to use the digital files. But is Liberia unique? Maybe not. There's a lot of regional similarities in Guinea and Ghana and Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso, et cetera. I have not gathered any evidence from the actual archival record of the Voice of America in Washington. I'm dying to get there. I want to get more of that guidance. It says, thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. There's sketchy papers. Leo Sarkisian and the Voice of America was never told to create an archive, so they didn't. We're lucky that it exists and not in a salt mine in Eastern Pennsylvania, Western. The incomplete record that I showed before is also dogging us. We know that that any given show is probably broadcast 2 or 3 times more frequently than the record shows. But all that does is amplify. So the AFL band or the elephant tusk messages was there no matter what, over and over and over and over again, timed to the growing chaos in Liberia and the effort to say, you know, music is a universal language. Can't we all? Do we really have to do this? And so it's heart-wrenching in that regard. Quickly, these are my last 3 slides. There's a lot of work that can be done with a collection like this and other international radio on the whole politics of international radio broadcasting beyond just the sheer historical understanding of radio as radio, but why these broadcasts in these places at this time. There's also this increase understanding or a way to pull apart using these kinds of materials of the kind of obsession by musicologists, historians, anthropologists to put names, to put people in boxes, to put people in tribal groups, to put people along borders, et cetera. And this kind of a resource forces you to question the way in which academia tends to name things. Also, archivists, if you have to put a label on something and you have to name it, then what are you doing with the naming piece that you're doing? Leo was not immune by naming people in his notes, but the question of how that carries forth going forward is an open question. And then the notion of ethnomusicology and radio being more allied than they are at present time, they're quite separate. It should be obvious that none of this could happen without the digital affordances that come through digitization and open access. We're sitting on piles and piles of material that we can't use until it's digital. And I may be speaking to the converted, but that's been my message for a couple decades now of my own work. The notion of bringing together multimodal resources in libraries and archives and museums, we tend to classify, organize, and deliver by media. Okay, once it's all digital, it's all digital. So, but we have to think about how we organize and make available material that's diverse and whatever. This repatriation through rebroadcast it's pretty clear that if this material is available widely, it will be listened to. I get a lot of feedback from the email us note, and I would say that the vast majority of the listeners are in Africa. By the IP addresses that we get. And the vast majority of the listeners are enjoying it. So again, our academic mission to favor perhaps the kind of deep thinking or pointy-headed academic work that I'm demonstrating in my juxtaposition of history with radio isn't necessarily what our true calling is. Maybe it's just to give people a good time. And the same with your African American archive. It may just be that the stuff is really, really fun to listen to. And that might be a sufficient rationale for access, not necessarily because somebody's going to revolutionize the scholarly world of African American music any more than they're going to do what I've been doing here. The role of the archivist in researching, if I was wearing an archivist hat instead of a retired professor hat, would I be allowed or encouraged to do the same kind of thing as a professional archivist as I do because I have the luxury and the passion to be able to plunge into this collection. There's a lot of property rights issues that we could bring up in Q&A. And then the whole issue of how we describe, I think I mentioned it in a previous slide, but the minute we start breaking down or bring material that is in theory diverse and separate, maps, with photographs, with scripts, with sound recordings, and bringing them all into one mush. Then there's a lot of technical descriptive work that isn't ready for that kind of archival and library work. So that's it. I got one more little, I got to end with Rita.
And that does it for today, friends. Thank you for joining me. I've enjoyed being with you, so let's get together again next Sunday. This is Rita Rochelle saying so long for Music Time in Africa and inviting you to stay tuned for a summary of the world news. We wish you all the very best for the week.
Thank you very much. Okay.
So thank you so much. Let's see
I have to exit.
moderate some questions from Zoom and from the audience here. If folks have questions, I'm going to bring you the microphone to speak to so that the Zoom audience can hear you. And if we have questions in the Q&A from Zoom, none right now. Or if people want to speak their questions in Zoom, we can unmute you on Zoom and let you speak into the room.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Jason.
Yes. Thank you so much for really kind of layered presentation. So my name is Jason Schultz. I'm one of the librarians here. I do have an African studies background, so actually research in Liberia, and work with the Africana Librarians Council. So I saw Lloyd and Babu in the background too, as well, one of my colleagues. One question is more academic, just kind of aside, talking with the work that Leo said. You mentioned Sarkisian actually worked with the State Department. I'm thinking of, this is just an aside, just an interesting thing. Also at your school is Penny Von Eschner, has been too as well, in the State Department, the travels of American jazz musicians. Was Leo involved with that as well? As an aside, it'd just be interesting to know that, because I went to Zimbabwe and met with musicians that worked with Louis Armstrong in the 50s. So
Right.
Be curious to know with that. So that's one question that's just kind of aside. The more direct kind of librarian question for Access is that, so have you worked with Coherent Digital much? If you know who they are, we just purchased their platform and I don't see the archive there. I have a feeling because is this archive actually hosted through the iSchool and not the library?
That good question.
So-
I can pick the set. I can. Yeah. The first question, my colleague Kelly Askew is deeply plugged into performing communities and property communities, copyright issues in both East and West Africa. So our entree into the underlying kind of the current state of cultural heritage music is through Kelly's ongoing amazing active research. My work has been, in terms of liaison, is to focus on working with the Voice of America to negotiate the gift agreements, to transfer the rights agreements, to get accretions to the collection itself. But we have not worked with other government agencies. And pointedly, off the record, but I can't be off the record because everybody's here. We developed a memo of understanding directly between the Voice of America and the University of Michigan, and went around the National Archives and Records Administration because of a catch-22 situation. If these records were appraised as permanent, they couldn't have been donated to the University of Michigan. If they were appraised as impermanent, there'd have to be a time frame put on how long the project would go, and that time frame was rather short. So I knew a little something about the appraisal peculiarities of the National Archives, and we just decided to negotiate directly with the Voice of America, and it leaves us kind of open down the road for these are government records. and we have to do something about that. The other peculiarity, which is alluded to in your second question, is that yes, this Music Time in Africa is sitting on a School of Information lab server. It's backed up. It's wonderful. I mean, it's always online. It's fabulous. So I feel confident about it. But I'm retired, and with an emeritus status. We have not yet been able to get this entire project fully embraced by the University of Michigan Library. I'm working on it, and before I die, it will happen. But it might take that long because this is the issue of faculty-driven projects in a research library as opposed to library and curatorial-driven projects. And this project highlights all of the dysfunctionality of those two approaches. It's not always dysfunctional, but when it is, it's dysfunctional. And there's some real issues here. I'm working on it, and we think we will solve the problem largely by raising a whole lot of money to build a repository. That money is what will make it grease the skids. So there's all kinds of complicated issues here.
The reason why I bring it up is that coherent digital, what it is, they're not ingesting it. What they're doing, they're linking out to individual archives mostly, and they have an Africa platform too as well.
Yeah.
They have Southern, we've just purchased it. So there's digitized
Right.
magazines, there's digitized movies from Southern Africa. And so they're trying to do the web archiving themselves.
Yeah.
But it's linked out to Michigan State, obviously, and others as well. So I just did a quick peek and I didn't see it, but I was like, because it's through the iSchool,
Yeah.
likely not
It's
through the library. So
it's
it's
possible
interesting.
we could do it that way. Okay, good. More questions.
Thanks, Paul. That was wonderful and, layered and very deep. I'm Rogers Hall from Peabody. I'll be talking tomorrow. So I'm noticing the images of people listening to transistor radios. And I also have never heard before, but was delighted to learn about the peak of recordings, which then the recording activity stops and the use continues. I assume that use is just rebroadcast of entire Voice of America.
Mhm.
Okay, so the question is, what is known about listener activity? I mean, I understand the
Mhm.
broadcast, but who's listening? What is known about who's listening? That is a very broad question.
For the Voice of America itself, which has broadcasts in 43 languages, it's a Cold War operation, but it's also a global in scope. Up until the early 1980s, there were no listener surveys other than the fan mail. Leo's wasn't the only program that received fan mail. So this informal but pretty significant dive into the people that were writing, especially when, if you put a stamp in 1965, you put a stamp in Nigeria, Lagos, and send it to the United States, it's $5 or it's out of your pocket. It's real expensive. So the fan mail, but in 1980, the VOA started commissioning fairly regular third-party listener and audience surveys. With turnover in the VOA headquarters, they wanted more of this. And the problem with I've seen some of the surveys. That's why one of the reasons I need to go to the National Archives. But they were the bottom line is that they were doing them. How much that those listener surveys actually influenced anything is an open question. And also the surveys that I've been lucky enough to see so far suffer from the same social science methodology problems of what's the population, what's the sample, how do you if you want a statistically meaningful result in any given country when there's a literacy level of 15%, what do you do? So there was some creative work. Lately, in the last decade or so, I think this work has been tied to more commercial radio listening survey methodologies, and they may have a better handle. If Heather is here and wanted to weigh in or later about what surveys they're doing now, but in the heyday of the period that I'm talking about, it was mostly user feedback from letters and not a lot of survey work. What government agency do you know that does user feedback? You know, the IRS? No, I don't know. So it's a good question, but there isn't a lot from this period. Is there any Zoom questions at all? Okay.
Hi, I'm Faith McConnon. I'm with the Special Collections and University Archives here. And my question, well, first, I love the presentation.
Thank you.
And my question is leaning towards the repatriation aspect of having these recordings and digitizing them and sending them over. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more onto repatriation and what it looks like for today's generations to be listening to these recordings from back then.
Our rationale, and in a way it is a rationale, it's not a legal read of the impossibly complex international copyright laws. You've got, you know, the Berne Convention that some but not all African countries have agreed to, and then you've got a country like Ghana that's nationalized its cultural heritage and claims to be the keeper of the review. So our overall rationale was that first, this was a radio broadcast. So it was heard freely and openly in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and is still being heard openly. The Voice of America's own charter has some interesting language to protect itself from copyright claims, although I've heard from Voice of America employees, some employees, that they work very hard on the permissions piece of it, but it's not formal copyright clearance. So but because they're the Voice of America and they have a legal charter that allows them to essentially do what they want in the broadcast arena, unlike a commercial radio station that has to pay royalties out for every song that they play, the Voice of America isn't there. So our rationale was this was once freely broadcast, why not do it again? Then the question is, what about the underlying music? And it's a mix of commercially produced, but now rare, obscure, and really difficult to find 45s and LPs like the Fatu Gay Floor's work. Or it is recordings made by Leo on tapes that very visibly declare this is US government property. So the media of those tapes belongs to the US government unambiguously. The sound itself belongs to the people who are recorded on them and noted in the notes. So that in theory could create problems. Then we have AIDS, Ebola, civil war in which 15% of the population died, et cetera. And so what we owe, we feel our rationale is that we owe rebroadcast as repatriation to the dead and buried, as much as we do to one individual that might say, this is my grandfather's belly harp recording and I want to be paid for it. So it's a risk analysis, which we're going to talk about a bit tomorrow in copyright. It's what's the risk analysis that is never 100% black and white, ever, no matter how much work you put into clearance. So our rationale about the origins of the collection and our moral obligation we feel to the people who are represented on it, rather than the monetary obligation. We would never sell it. It's been ripped. We found some of the Guinea recordings that Leo had made and put onto LPs that are really, really hard to find. Somebody found them and ripped the Guinea and was marketing a pirated CD out of Canada. So we went after them. And I don't know, it made no difference, but at least we served warning to this pirate that we didn't like the fact that they stole the Guinea recordings. We're in favor of non-commercials, that we would never sell this. So that what we felt back on, to sum it up, is a kind of moral, ethical argument of a balancing act in which the balance argued for proceeding. And then on the website itself, when you click on the contact us, there's a takedown policy, which is a University of Michigan pioneered process that basically says, if you don't like this, we'll take it down right now while we have a conversation. It came out of HathiTrust, the Google Books digitization project. which went to the Supreme Court 6-3 in favor of this takedown policy. So we said, if it's good enough for 6-3, which 6, I don't know, can't say. Why not? So we use a take, but basically if anybody complains, we'll say, we'll take it down and we'll have a conversation. It hasn't happened so far. And in the Hathi Trust, which has 20 million books, they have 400 claims out of 20 million. So that's the risk analysis that we're going to focus on a bit tomorrow is at what point can we say the teeter-totter is tipped so much that we need to take action. And then the ethical and moral argument kicks in with full force. It's like, this is something we really have to do, not should.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, though. That's the lead into what I'm going to say tomorrow.
It looks like we have a question on Zoom.
Good.
Right. This is absolutely wonderful, Paul. Thank you. The richness of this collection is incredible. It makes me think about the significant challenge of providing access points for users to audio content or to the audio content. Could you speak a little bit to how this project is helping open the collection, either through the finding aid or other tools like a project website or contextual exhibits? And that's from Prudhomme.
Okay. That's a great question. I'm looking at the clock. I'll try to, there's three or four facets to it. The first is the whole digitization process and trying to extract text, which we did as was funded through the National Endowment for the Humanities. So we were able to support temporary workers and also students in my classes that learned how to do OCR work and cleanup. So there was a lot of student work that was done to get the text cleaned up, and there's a whole nother set of stories about that. Then the cataloging issues for formal library cataloging at the show item level. And we use the point in time of the show as the point of departure to bring together the diverse materials that document that point in time. That flies in the face of standard library cataloging, but we ended up being able to warp and modify the Library of Congress's MODS standard. I forget what MODS stands for, but there's a whole website for MODS. But MODS was flexible enough that it allowed us to catalog the script and whether or not there was a script with the show and whether or not the show was complete, and add the full text content as a note from the script. And Mark didn't allow us to do that. Dublin Core doesn't allow to do that. I do think that PB Core, we discovered PB. Okay, so that's the second piece. So for the shows, we use MODS. For the 360 tapes with their 2,170 tracks, we've used PB Core, the tools that have been developed out of GBH in Boston. And that's, I can't say enough. I could take another half an hour to explain why everybody should be looking very, very carefully at PB Core for audiovisual materials that have an analog component and a digital component. It's absolutely fabulous. So that's the good news, is that the cataloging data is all there, spreadsheets, a finding aid, et cetera. The bad news is that we haven't been able, because the University of Michigan Library is a bit behind the curve in being able to distribute this kind of complex, multimodal, state-of-the-art cataloging records at the item level through their existing system. That's why I'm interested in perhaps a partnership with a commercial firm or a non-commercial firm. But the library is making progress. I've been working on this for 15 years at the University of Michigan, and it hasn't quite come to fruition, but there's hope, more hope than there was, say, 2 years ago. But the real issue at the end is to be able to bundle up this kind of material and deliver it through standardized, turnkey, large-scale platforms, because nobody in their right mind right now would be custom building something for Music Time in Africa. That we need to be able to migrate and port this into media gateways and other tools that are out there. And we're working on it, but there's only so many meetings and so many email chains and so money is what's going to solve the problem here. But technically we've got our act together. But it hasn't borne fruit in full-fledged access to all the material. What we hope is that the finding aid will generate questions from users. That's why I'm doing these talks with 85 wonderful people in Zoom, because maybe a few of you will write through the finding aid and say, hey, how do I get this stuff? And it only takes 10 people to write and say, hey, how do I get this stuff? And then somebody says, okay, I guess we have to figure that out. It's the squeaky wheel. So these meetings become squeaky wheels for projects like this. And sometimes that's the only way to get it done. And money. Thank you for the question, though.
Thanks. Martin Fisher, Center for Popular Music at Middle Tennessee State. This might be a little bit ancillary to some of the other things going on, but I just kind of have a question about, was Leo hauling around battery or generator equipment, or were the various regions that he was going to do this recording, was it wired for electricity? Was it readily available for him to hook into to power his equipment? And would that have anything to do with the regions in which he did his recording, rather like at the borders, rather than in the center of the country, county, or whatever?
There was no electricity. He had a Jeep, a Range Rover for a while, and a Jeep provided first by Tempo Records International, and then by the Voice of America and USIA. But that car you saw in one of those photos that with the stuff on it, he was completely and utterly self-sufficient for days, and including personal effects. He and his wife, Mary, went with him everywhere. So it was both a personal journey as well as a self-sufficient recording operation, which he started in Afghanistan, learned how to do this in Afghanistan, and then what became Bangladesh, and then Guinea, Ghana, et cetera. So he was very used to, by the time he got to 1965, he was doing this for 10 years and was good at it. I'm convinced, until I get more archival evidence, but the evidence on the table presents itself as this is essentially an eyes and ears scouting party for the government of Liberia. And it was also a scouting party for the government of Guinea or Ghana or wherever he happened to be. I do not think that the innocent, I'm just love this music and I want to capture it so that the whole country of Africa can hear it. it doesn't make any sense logically or financially, because this was a USIS that was supporting this. And before that, it was the State Department. And before that, it was a private firm. So then why did they go where they went? And they always went to the border. And the borders were established. Okay, so Ghana became independent in 1957. Guinea in 1963 or 4, Sierra Leone in 64 or 5. These were newly independent countries with drawn borders by somebody. No surveys. And so when you look at the map of Guinea, it was weaving its way around the borderlands. Then you look at Liberia, it was weaving its way around the borderlands. So maybe I'll find archival evidence that says this is where you shall go. But the odds are that it was much more subtle and done in collaboration. In one of the scripts that does not have a broadcast that goes with it, but one of the scripts, Leo says to Rita in the script, I always worked with a high-level government official who knew the people that we were going to be talking to. And he named some of them, from the person from Guinea, and he named the person from Ghana who he worked with. And one was a famous musician in Guinea, also government official. Bai Timur is a poet, also government official. So I'm stretching here to make a kind of modest political point, but I don't think there's any coincidence between the location of the recordings and the political situation at the time the recordings were made, because Leo was completely self-sufficient and willing to get in a canoe with his tape recorder.
How was he powering them then? Was it a generator?
Yeah.
Was it batteries?
Diesel.
diesel, and I take it located a good distance from through drop cords or something. or the
That's a
equipment
good,
in important
yeah, you never
location.
heard, you don't hear, I've never heard a generator in any of the things that he's done. So that's a good question,
Okay,
but it was not battery powered.
thank you.
Yeah.
I'll try to be quick with this as I assume we're wrapping up. Nathan Jones, Vanderbilt Television News Archive.
Yeah.
How does the deed of gift look? Was it from Leo? How does this work? I mean, you've alluded to the fact that this is technically federal property. Could they not excise their rights to that at any time? Is ownership not contentious at best?
Okay, good. There are two memos of understanding. The second one is a codicil, a writing on the first one. The first one was done by Kelly Askew, working with our intellectual property lawyer, Jack Bernard, who's brilliant and willing to make things happen for faculty. What Kelly was doing with when Leo was still there was digitizing the field recordings. And we brought the field recordings to the University of Michigan, and one of our tech geniuses did amazing extraction. But at a point we got worried about who was going to own the digital material. And so the memo of understanding, Voice of America said to the University of Michigan, give us the tapes back because that's our property. You can have the digital files to do whatever you want for research and teaching, no non-commercial applications. And because we're a giant university, research and teaching is the main thing that we do. It opens up all kinds of legal and social uses for the material, including password protected. I mean, right now, all of those recordings, anybody at the University of Michigan can get them by logging into a server, but we're ready any day now to make them more available widely. So then the second MOU was, what do we do with 261 cubic feet of additional material? And so what we did is a limited loan, renewable. It's already been renewed once. Every 5 years it gets renewed, and the loan is for these materials to be digitized or made available for research and teaching purposes. So that's why we process the collection with a traditional finding aid. And also it's my single biggest argument why the library just simply has to. What we've built out of the MOU is the Leo and Mary Sarkisian collection. It exists as a library collection, and the physical materials are on library property. But what people call the curatorial functions and the access functions, somebody appointed to be responsible for that material, to carrying it forward. There is no one. I'm it. And so I'm an emeritus professor, and we haven't figured out who's going to be the curator. But it's been renewed once. It's going to be renewed again. What I've been talking to the Voice of America, they'd like to do a permanent loan. And the minute we do a permanent loan, I'm probably going to have to call the National Archives and say, oh, by the way, we have this collection. It's part of Record Group 306. And can somebody come and visit and write a memo that says this is cool? And then it'll be okay. Because it's easier to say you're sorry than to ask for permission. That's where we are right now.
So not to grossly overgeneralize, but just like my own institution, you're hanging on 503 and the fact that your digital copy is the transformative work?
Yes.
Right. Thank you.
Yes. That's also part of the Google Books.
And having it in the library, right?
Right. So we and I've been an advocate for 35 years for the transformative nature of digital work. That's why all of my writings and all of my reputation as a scholar comes from that single biggest thing, is that we're creating a new world out there, and it's digital, and it relates to the old world, but it's digital. And but fortunately, the law is starting to, at least in higher education, is starting to give us some tools. That doesn't mean that copyright lawyers in universities aren't petrified of these kinds of projects, and but at least the progress is slow and steady. For unpublished, you talk about LP collections or cassette collections or 45s where somebody at some point owned, printed, and published that thing. We've got a lot to talk about, but this material, most of it is unpublished. It's like the Grateful Dead recordings on the Internet Archive. It's the same thing. How are we doing time-wise? Are we all right?
We're
Okay,
8 minutes after.
okay.
Is there maybe one last question? Perhaps not. Well, that was fabulous.
Thank you.
I loved the examples, the musical examples. Thank you so much.
Thank you
A
for
little
coming.
Round of applause. There's still coffee and snacks and water in the back, so people who are in the room can do that. Zoom folks, thank you so much for being with us. Hopefully you'll come back to one of the other sessions, and any questions you can email me at the email address that you received the Zoom link at, and I look forward to hearing from you. I'll be sending out an assessment survey, which I hope you'll take. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Should I end the session?
Thanks.